Imagine living in a hole in the ground. The mud is waist-deep. You haven't been dry in 3 weeks. Rats the size of cats crawl over you while you sleep. If you can sleep over the constant sound of shells exploding nearby. The man who was standing next to you 5 minutes ago is now in pieces scattered across the trench. You're eating bread that tastes like the corpse decomposing in the wall 2 feet from your head. Your feet are rotting inside your boots. You haven't changed clothes in a month. Lice are eating you alive. And tomorrow morning, when the whistle blows, you're going to climb a ladder and run across open ground toward machine guns that fire 600 rounds per minute. This was daily life in the trenches of World War I. Not for a few days, not for a few weeks, for months, sometimes years, and at any random moment, while you're eating, sleeping, writing a letter home, or just standing there. An artillery shell could land directly on you and you'd cease to exist. The trenches weren't just dangerous. They were a unique form of hell that no previous war had created, and no war since has quite replicated. This is why they were the most dangerous job in World War I. Let's start with the thing that killed more men than anything else: artillery. Estimates suggest that 60 to 70% of all World War I casualties were caused by artillery shells. Not bullets, not bayonets, shells. Living in a trench meant living under constant bombardment. Before major attacks, the shelling could last for days, sometimes weeks. The British shelled German positions for 7 days straight before the Somme offensive. Imagine 7 days of constant explosions shaking the earth, collapsing trenches, burying men alive, and turning anyone caught in the open into red mist. The sound alone was enough to drive men insane. Veterans described it as beyond human comprehension, a continuous roar that made thinking impossible, that made your organs vibrate, that felt like the world was ending. The pressure waves from nearby explosions could rupture your internal organs without shrapnel ever touching you. You'd just start bleeding from your nose and ears and collapse dead without a visible wound, and you never knew when it was coming. You could be eating a meal, writing a letter home, or sleeping, and suddenly the man next to you simply wasn't there anymore. Just a crater and scattered body parts. There was no warning, no chance to take cover, just random death falling from the sky continuously. This randomness was psychologically devastating. In other forms of combat, you might feel some sense of control. You could fight back, take cover, make decisions. In a trench under bombardment, you just waited to see if the next shell had your name on it. Then there were the snipers. Both sides employed highly skilled marksmen who watched the enemy trenches through periscope sights 24 hours a day. Any soldier who carelessly raised his head above the parapet for even a second could be shot through the skull. Good snipers had hundreds of confirmed kills. That's hundreds of men who made one tiny mistake, glanced over the edge at the wrong moment, moved past a gap in the sandbags, or silhouetted themselves against the sky at dawn. Snipers also engaged in psychological warfare. They would deliberately wound, rather than kill when possible, because a wounded man screaming in no man's land would draw others to try to rescue him, creating more targets. Imagine having to listen to your friend dying 50 yards away, crying for help, and knowing that going to help him meant certain death. Sometimes men lay wounded in no man's land for days, their cries for help gradually weakening until silence. Everyone in the trenches had to listen. At night, the terror took a different form. Both sides conducted trench raids, small groups of soldiers sneaking through no man's land to attack enemy trenches. These raids meant close-quarters combat in confined spaces. Men fought with trench knives designed specifically for stabbing in narrow trenches, with clubs embedded with nails, with sharpened entrenching tools used as axes, with revolvers and grenades in close quarters. Raiders would kill sentries silently, then suddenly appear in your trench in the darkness. The fighting was brutal, chaotic, and personal. Hand-to-hand combat in the dark, with explosions and screams echoing off trench walls. Every night, men strained their ears, listening for sounds of raiders approaching. The stress was constant. You never felt safe, even in your own trench. Sleep was difficult, when every sound might be an enemy about to kill you. But the absolute worst moment, the most dangerous thing you could be ordered to do, was going over the top. When an attack was ordered, soldiers had to climb out of the relative safety of trenches and advance across no man's land toward enemy positions. Exit the trench via ladders, often already under fire. Cross 100 to 500 yards of open ground. Navigate through barbed wire that was often still intact, despite the preliminary bombardment. Face machine gun fire. 600 rounds per minute. Face artillery. Shells already pre-targeted on no man's land. Face rifle fire from defenders in protected positions. All while carrying 60 to 70 pounds of equipment. At the Battle of the Somme, British forces suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day. 20,000 dead. Many were killed in the first few minutes of going over the top. Some units lost 90% of their men before reaching enemy trenches. Officers would blow whistles. Men would climb ladders knowing most wouldn't come back. Machine guns were pre-sighted on the gaps in barbed wire. Artillery was pre-targeted on likely approach routes. Defenders had every advantage. Attackers knew they were probably going to die. They went anyway because refusing meant being shot by your own officers for cowardice. Because the culture made cowardice seem worse than death. Because you didn't want to let down your friends. Or because you were simply following orders mechanically in a state of shock. Then there was poison gas. First used in 1915, gas became a signature horror of trench warfare. Chlorine gas burned lungs and caused drowning as lungs filled with fluid. Phosgene had a delayed effect. You'd seem fine at first, then your lungs would fail hours later. Mustard gas burned skin, caused blindness, destroyed lungs, and left survivors permanently disabled. Gas attacks gave little warning. A sentry might shout, "Gas!" and everyone had seconds to put on gas masks. Early masks were primitive and often didn't work. Men would die slowly, drowning in their own fluids, unable to breathe, clawing at their throats. Even with good masks, the terror of gas attacks left lasting trauma. The helplessness of facing an invisible weapon that could kill you slowly was psychologically devastating. But even without all these ways of dying in combat, the trenches themselves were trying to kill you through simple living conditions. The trenches turned into mud pits. Rain and poor drainage meant soldiers stood in water and mud that could be waist deep. Men literally drowned in mud after being wounded and unable to move. Their feet, constantly wet and cold, would rot. The condition was called trench foot. Flesh would die and turn black. In severe cases, toes or entire feet had to be amputated. There were tens of thousands of cases. The trenches were infested with rats, some as big as cats, that fed on corpses and food supplies. They would crawl over sleeping men at night. They carried disease. They were everywhere and couldn't be eliminated. Every soldier also had body lice. The itching was constant and maddening. Lice spread trench fever, which caused severe flu-like symptoms. Men would spend hours trying to kill lice in their clothing seams. It was futile. They always came back. Bodies were everywhere. Corpses were often buried in trench walls or left in no man's land, because retrieving them was impossible. Rain would expose bodies that had been buried in parapets. The smell was unbearable. Men ate, slept, and fought, surrounded by decomposing corpses, sometimes their friends. Disease spread rapidly in these unsanitary conditions. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid. Many soldiers died from disease rather than combat. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical danger. Unlike modern warfare with defined combat periods, trench warfare meant you were in danger 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even in so-called quiet sectors, men were killed daily by random shells or sniper fire. There was no true rear area. Between major offensives, soldiers waited, and waited, knowing that eventually orders would come to go over the top. Days, weeks, or months of anticipation could be worse than the attack itself. In close quarters, you became intimately familiar with your comrades. Then you watched them die, often horribly. The man next to you could be alive 1 second and dead the next. This happened repeatedly. Some soldiers spent months in the trenches. Some spent years with only brief rotations to rest areas that were still within artillery range. There was little you could do to improve your odds. You just waited for death to randomly select you or someone nearby. Even in quiet sectors with no major attacks, both sides typically suffered thousands of casualties daily. The British averaged 2,000 to 3,000 casualties per day on the Western Front. That's every day, even without major battles. New officers on the Western Front had an average survival time of 6 weeks. Infantry soldiers in active sectors survived weeks to months. In major offensives, survival time was measured in hours or days. At the Battle of Verdun, 700,000 men became casualties over 10 months. Survivors called it hell on earth. Some sectors had 100% casualty rates. Every single soldier who fought there became a casualty. At the Somme, over 1 million total casualties in 141 days. Some units experienced 90% casualty rates. One British soldier wrote after the war, "The noise was beyond anything you can imagine." Men were being blown apart, bits of bodies everywhere. The screaming never stopped. You couldn't help your mates. You were just trying to survive the next second. I saw my best friend's head disappear. One moment talking to me, the next moment just gone. We kept living and sleeping next to where he died because there was nowhere else to go. A German soldier described it this way: "For 3 days, the British shelled us without stopping. You couldn't hear your own thoughts. Men went mad. When it finally stopped and they attacked, we were so broken we could barely fight. But we did. We killed them by the hundreds. Then the shelling started again. This is not war. This is extermination." A French soldier at Verdun said, "Verdun is not a battle. It is a meat grinder. Men go in, meat comes out. The ground is not earth anymore. It is decomposed human flesh mixed with mud. You drink water that has dead bodies in it. You sleep on corpses. You go mad or you become not human anymore." The ultimate irony was that after enduring all this horror, the shells, snipers, gas, rats, mud, lice, disease, and constant death, soldiers were then ordered to leave the relative safety of trenches and charge across open ground toward machine guns. That's when the most men died. The trenches were supposed to protect them, but they became a prison from which the only escape was going over the top, which usually meant death. World War I trenches traumatized an entire generation. Shell shock sufferers filled hospitals for decades. Survivors had nightmares for life. Many never spoke of what they experienced. When World War II came, military doctrine focused obsessively on avoiding trench warfare. The memory was so traumatic that generals would plan for anything except repeating that horror. So why were the trenches the most dangerous job in World War I? Because they combined every form of danger into one inescapable nightmare. Constant artillery, snipers, raiders at night, poison gas, disease, horrific living conditions, psychological torture, and the knowledge that eventually you'd be ordered to climb out and face almost certain death in an attack across open ground. You couldn't escape. You couldn't hide. You just waited and hoped the next shell, the next bullet, the next gas attack wouldn't be the one that killed you. And if you survived long enough, they'd blow a whistle and you'd have to climb a ladder into machine gun fire. That was life and death in the trenches of World War I.